Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
In her classic exploration of the tragic fascism of the mid-20th century in Europe, Hannah Arendt wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism, one of the greatest advantages of the totalitarian elites of the 20s and 30s was to turn any statement of fact into a question of motive. Recently, Trump's surrogate Scotty Nell Hughes said something quite similar on the Diane Rehm show on NPR when she said, quote, "There's no such thing anymore, unfortunately, as facts." The Oxford English Dictionary made the word post-truth their word of the year. To help us understand what all of this means, I am honored to welcome to this program Professor Jacob T. Levy. Jacob is the Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory. He is with the Political Science Department and the Department of Philosophy at McGill University. And his most recent essay is Authoritarianism and Post-Truth Politics. Jacob, welcome to the program. I'm really glad you're here.
Thank you very much for having me.
I would like to try to connect those dots between Hannah Arendt and all of those who have gone before us, who have written so profoundly regarding demagoguery, totalitarianism, and the things we truly should fear in our politics, the worst of our politics, let's just say, and what is happening today, not just in America, but what we are seeing in democracies around the world. Help us understand your thesis in your recent essay regarding post-truth politics. What are you referring to, and how should we wrap our minds around this dynamic?
So the idea of post-truth politics isn't new with me. That's a thought that's been bruited about a fair amount over the last several months, particularly in the wake of Donald Trump's election, but also in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit referendum, when it really did seem that truthful claims that had been made by the Remain side of the Brexit campaign had been just disregarded, and genuinely nonsensical claims about how budget arrangements would work or about what Britain's bargaining position would be after the fact that the Leave campaign had made were given very wide currency, sufficiently wide currency that it appeared that the voters were substantially uninterested in the truth or falsehood of what was being asserted. My concern in the essay is to say that the general supposed phenomenon of post-truth politics doesn't fully get at some of what's most dangerous about Donald Trump's relationship to untruth. Democratic politics relies on a certain amount of interest in truth and the facts. There's too much that depends on public speech and on people being able to hear and listen and evaluate claims for that not to be true. But what's at stake in Trump's distinctive kind of untruth, it seems to me, is not only about a malfunctioning of democratic politics in the way that people who talked about the Brexit referendum were concerned with. It's more specifically lies as a source of power. And this is why I went back to not only Arendt, but George Orwell and Václav Havel in order to think about how lies had been used as tools of active power building and repression in mid-20th century authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. It's not that I think that Trump deliberately, knowingly emulates such regimes, but I think that he's had a whole lifetime of being someone who asserts personal dominance around people around him, or over people around him, rather. He likes to subordinate people to him and to make them personally dependent on him. And one of the most effective ways to both do that and to show that you've done that is to make other people repeat your lies. This, it seems to me, was something that Trump did over and over again on the campaign trail. He made outrageous statements in his rallies, but then he insisted that his surrogates go on, say, the Sunday morning network talk shows and repeat them. If one of them tried to modify the claim a little bit or soften it a little bit, he would be on Twitter denouncing tacitly his surrogate, sometimes Mike Pence in particular, for not having understood that, no, he really means the false claim. And the falsehoods were often gratuitous and often really easily checked. So while some of his lies have tactical advantage, he lies to the public about the state of the world. Some of his lies, it seemed to me, had a much narrower and stranger audience. They provided a kind of loyalty test. Who is it who's willing to so debase their own character and the value of their own word that they will go out and repeat verbatim the plain falsehoods that he's been announcing? Rudy Giuliani excelled in this. Chris Christie was very good at it. Kellyanne Conway would sometimes have a wink and a nudge, but sometimes get called to account by Trump on Twitter for doing so. Every time someone did this, they undermined their own independent standing in the public sphere. Rudy Giuliani's word isn't worth anything anymore. Chris Christie's word isn't worth anything anymore. The only public standing they have anymore is what Trump gives them. So making them repeat his lies not only demonstrates his power over them, it secures it, it enhances it. This is a phenomenon that Arendt and Orwell, and in some ways especially Václav Havel, documented in the totalitarian systems. Havel says that the repetition of the party's lies in communist Eastern Europe, even when everyone knew they were lies, when there was no effect of persuading anyone of the false state of affairs, it was how you signaled that you were obedient. And it was the way that the party could turn everyone into a monitor of everyone else. The person who broke the norm of lying, the person who told the truth about something the party insisted on lying about, that was your dangerous dissident. No one might have supported the party, and indeed by the late 1980s in Havel's Czechoslovakia, almost no one did. But the regime demonstrated tremendous stability for a very long time because there was no ability to speak in public about what was being done. And part of how that power on the party's part was secured was through this insistence on constant public falsehood. And, Havel said, it makes everyone complicit. It gives everyone a guilty conscience. It makes it hard to stand up the next day and say, I'm better than this terrible regime, because you know that yesterday you helped spread the terrible regime's falsehoods. That undermining of the standing of your own word, it seems to me, is one of the ways that untruth really enhances power. And that's not just a feature of general public debate. There has to be a power wielder there. The Nazi Party, the Communist Party, or in this case, Trump, even when Trump was just a private domineering figure, and even much more so now that he's about to become a public domineering figure. There's lying as an instrument of bullying and forcing others to be complicit in your lies as an instrument of power. That, it seems to me, is a different and much more dangerous phenomenon, even than the already very bad phenomenon of widespread public disregard for facts.
Jacob, what does it say about democracy in the 21st century, and in particular American democracy, that we see these classic fascist techniques, the tools of fascism, being so successfully employed in established democracies in the 21st century? What does it say about democracy, which any student of democracy knows the fragility of a democratic system and its vulnerability to these kind of tools? But what does it say about American democracy in the 21st century?
We don't yet know how bad the effects of this election are going to be. I feel confident in saying very bad and worse than I can easily wrap my mind around. But how bad the long-term damage to liberal democracy or democratic institutions will be, I don't think that's yet knowable. I don't think it's yet fixed. There are, I hope, things that we can do in the intervening 4 years to mitigate the damage. It certainly shows that some norms of liberal democracy were genuinely not as robust, genuinely not as secure and safe as we had thought they were in a developed democracy like the United States. There are increasing turns to populist authoritarianism in a number of Western democracies. Some of what Trump represents isn't unique to the United States. But that in the country that had prided itself on as being the oldest, the most developed, the most institutionally secure, the most institutionally uninterrupted constitutional democracy in the world, to fall prey to this combination of aggressive demagoguery and populist authoritarianism and disregard for democratic norms and disregard for procedures, it says things that deeply worry me. What the consequences are going to be, I don't think that anyone should feel too confident in saying yet. There is, Adam Smith once said, a great deal of ruin in a nation. That is, there's a great deal of capacity to absorb damage in long-standing institutions and to survive them. It's just that I think that the question right now genuinely is, are the institutions robust enough to survive this? I'm hopeful. I don't think that the United States is facing an actual collapse of its constitutional democracy, but I think that it's in some of the gravest danger that it's ever been.
We're talking with Jacob Levy. He is the Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory at McGill University, and you can follow him on Twitter at JTL Levy. Speaking of Twitter, Jacob, how should we understand social media in today's politics in this context of a Trump victory? And we should note, a victory in the American Electoral College, not nearly a victory in the popular vote. Hillary Clinton received, what is it now, 2.8 million more votes and climbing. But we have a president-elect who literally threatens people with his Twitter account. And I don't think we've ever seen anything remotely like that in the American presidential politics. It is just, as you said, this is so far beyond the norms that we're used to. What's your perspective on that element of this conversation?
It deeply undermines norms of generality. It's absolutely true that Twitter in particular has become home over the last several years to a particularly toxic and threatening brand of some kind of demagoguery and right-wing populism, ultimately including the neo-Nazi alt-right. And it's true that Trump is more than willing to hold up particular individuals in ways that let them be targeted, encourage his millions of Twitter followers to personally target them. This happened to the leader of the labor union at the Carrier plant, who commented that the deal that he claimed credit for to keep about half of that plant open wasn't done in consultation with the union and wasn't actually a very good deal for the workers. Trump personally called the man out, and as a result, harassment by the thousands and tens of thousands began on Twitter and spilled off of Twitter into other media. Even beyond the singling out of individuals, there's something really extraordinary about, say, Trump's open dismissal of Boeing last week, at a moment when there was a question about Boeing's contract to build new Air Force One planes. You expect that when you're doing business with the government of the United States, that contracts are pretty stable things. You expect that processes that meet bidding requirements will be normally honored. Trump's career in real estate was marked significantly by a sense that all deals are always open to renegotiation. We saw this when we learned about how often he didn't pay contractors and subcontractors on his deals. We learned it in his description of what he does as being constantly deal-making. Not project building, but deal-making. He thinks that things are always subject to aggressively talking down the other side. On the campaign trail, he talked about the possibility of talking down the American national debt, which the Constitution insists may not be called into question, and which is the bedrock of the international financial system. But in his deal-making mode, and in the mode in which he uses bankruptcy as a tool in his private real estate business, he said, well, let's tell our creditors that we might or might not pay them back, and then they'll give us a better deal. When you combine that mindset with the particularism of Twitter, where you're commenting on a particular person, a particular company, a particular institution, it means that generality and rule of law norms go right out the window. There's no way now for us to think that Boeing is operating under normal governing contracting procedures with the United States government. Trump has put them on public notice that they're among his targets now, and if he wants to renege or renegotiate, that's what he'll do. That's not how government contracting works in a rule of law governed, non-corrupt society. Twitter's ability to amplify some of Trump's worst traits as a prospective leader, as a figure in authority, has been a pretty extraordinary thing to see over the last year. Even when he wasn't threatening, he would carry on long-term Twitter feuds with people like Alicia Machado or with the Khan family after the Democratic National Convention. Those were cases in which his disregard for the truth was more callous and I think less calculated than the phenomenon I was talking about earlier. He just threw things at Machado or at the Khans without any interest in whether what he was saying was true, but also without caring very much when it was shown that they weren't, as when he charged that Mrs. Khan had been forced to remain silent during the Democratic National Convention because she's a Muslim woman and maybe she's not allowed to talk in public. When the next day she talked in public and said, that wasn't true, I just didn't speak because, well, it's very upsetting for me to speak on my dead son on national television. Trump didn't feel embarrassed or abashed, but he didn't stick with the line either. He just shrugged and moved on. But over and over again, he, more than any other public figure who uses Twitter, he used Twitter for very personalized or particular or individualized kinds of quarrels. He does it with different news outlets one at a time. He'll decide that this week he's unhappy with the New York Times and last week he's unhappy with CNN. And He will beat the drum over and over again about how terrible this one news media organization is. That's a deeply abnormal, threatening kind of thing for a president of the United States to be willing to do. I read a report that said that, and I don't know whether this is true, but it was reported in a reputable media source. I read a report that said there was genuine argument on Barack Obama's transition team about whether he could retain an individual email account at all, because one expects that people who are contacting the president or who are receiving presidential communications will go through a certain kind of vetting process, and the presidential communications will be checked to make sure that they are compatible with public policy and with the law. In the last couple of weeks of the campaign, Trump's team seems to have successfully persuaded him to stop manning his Twitter account himself. And every time he stopped tweeting himself, he ceased to be the object of bad news coverage. But the day after the election, he got his Twitter account back, and he hasn't stopped since then. The things that we saw that were worrying on the campaign trail about his uninterest in general norms, his uninterest in rules, his uninterest in checking whether the thought that just crossed his mind at 3 o'clock in the morning is compatible with broad rules of policy. This becomes massively more dangerous once he's president-elect or president. We saw this with the Taiwan story 2 weeks ago. His willingness to just express irritation that people were criticizing him for having taken a direct call from the president of Taiwan in violation of the United States' longstanding norms around the One China policy. His willingness to just use that irritation and lash out meant that he was remaking U.S.-China-Taiwan policy on the fly without responsible people in the State Department checking whether what he was saying was remotely compatible with the rules of diplomatic public statements about relations between China and Taiwan. To say we've never seen anything like this doesn't even begin to express the magnitude of both the novelty and the danger here.
Yeah. So and in that respect, what should journalists like myself or political scientists like yourself and your peers, what should we be keeping in mind as we engage in our jobs, our tasks, our challenges to make sense of these new anti-norms in the Trump era? What should journalists do? What should political scientists be doing? What should inform the narratives that we are challenged with writing to try and explain this to people?
I don't have any easy answers to that, other than to say we have to continue trying as best we can to tell the truth. But there were very many reporters who did honorable work trying as best they could to tell the truth day after day during the campaign. One thing that turned out to be the case on the campaign trail was that the sheer volume of untruth, the sheer number of lies that Trump would tell in a day, meant that it was impossible for the coverage of any one of them to get any traction. When you think about how many politicians have been brought down by one dumb statement or one terrible act, Joe Biden's 1988 presidential campaign self-destructed because he plagiarized in 2 speeches. And having plagiarized in 2 speeches and been caught, the coverage was only ever going to be about that story ever again. And he understood that, and he understood that it meant that his campaign was no longer viable, and he was gone. No one story was able to last more than 2 or 3 days with respect to Donald Trump, because he would say or do some new outrageous thing. He has excellent show business instincts. He knows when it's time to change a story, and partly through the use of the Twitter account to say things that are outrageous directly to an audience of millions without having to persuade reporters that it's newsworthy, he kept being able to change the story. So if we were concerned about the question, how to persuade voters by the tens of millions that a particular lie matters, what does that seems to be a certain kind of insistence of repetition. And no individual reporter is going to be able to do it. There were print journalists who would stick with the story of, say, the Trump Foundation and the suspicion that Trump's charitable giving had been largely self-serving, that foundation funds had been used illegally to pay personal expenses, that he had not fulfilled long-time pledges to give charitably, and so on. A reporter would cover that story for weeks on end. But if there's not uptake from other reporters, then it's not the story. Now that we're not in campaign mode, I'm not sure whether persuading people by the tens of millions to care about this story is the challenge at all. The challenge is going to be to push back against untruth on a dozen dimensions at once every day. And we've never seen something like that done successfully. So we don't yet know what it would take to do it.
You're listening to my conversation with Jacob Levy. We'll take a very quick break, and Jacob will join us in the second half of this program. In a sense, Jacob, we're seeing a wholesale rejection of some of the very principles that created what we call the modern world. I mean, there seems to be, in the 17th and 18th centuries, a real rejection. I mean, it comes out of Rousseau and Hobbes and Locke, and then in the American and French revolutions, this rejection of a world based on dogma, superstition, untruths, raw power that relies on brute force and not facts. And for modernity, the embrace of science and truth and a free press and public education and the very principles of an empowered citizenry. And when we talk about them being empowered, we begin with the very idea that they are empowered with truth and facts and science, and that these matter. And those very revolutionary ideas created what we call the modern world. And yet we still see these medieval fascist tactics resurfacing every now and then, and they never, ever bring goodwill, progress. It is always coupled with tragedy and loss and horror. And correct me if I'm wrong, but is this in the 21st century? Are we seeing a kind of repudiation of the founding ideas of modernity?
I don't much believe in ideas like the founding ideals of modernity, and I don't much believe that the Enlightenment marked some revolutionary break with human history with respect to matters of truth and falsehood. The core of the 20th century, say the era from 1914 to 1989, from the beginning of World War I to the fall of the Berlin Wall. That's 75 years of the 225 years, if you want to think that way, since about the time of the American Revolution. And those 75 years were, as a matter of worldwide fact, more devoted to more political horror and more political lying and more political deep immorality and violence than had been true at almost any time in human history, rivaled only by, say, some of the worst moments of the European genocide against Native Americans in the earliest stages of colonization. The last 200 years haven't somehow been a morally transformed time. And as someone who teaches a course about the medieval era, I will always insist. You said medieval fascist. Fascism is a modern fact. Fascism is a modern institution, a creation of modern mass politics. It has nothing to do with the Middle Ages, and the Middle Ages were not a time when people were uninterested in truth and honesty. They had fewer scientific tools than we did, and they had a much smaller literate audience for making inquiries. Why do I insist on that? Why does that difference matter? Well, because the idea that modernity is distinctively the era of honesty and knowledge and enlightenment leads us to think that we can coast on it. It leads to a kind of complacency that says the normal state of affairs, now that humanity has grown up, is that things go better. Politics isn't like that. The normal state of affairs is not necessarily what's normatively attractive. And trying to keep politics minimally decent and humane, trying to keep free societies minimally free and constitutional governments minimally constrained by constitutionalism and the rule of law, that is a constant effort every generation and not something that the course of history has swept us along toward.
We're talking with Jacob Levy. He is the Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory and an associate member of the Department of Philosophy as well at McGill University. His most recent book is Rationalism, Pluralism and Freedom. And his most recent essay is Authoritarianism and Post-Truth Politics. Jacob, I follow your Twitter, and I've been reading today that you've been writing a lot about the idea of legitimacy. What sparked that conversation, and what does that mean in terms of this coming Trump era of politics in America? We have the CIA saying that the Russians have hacked our election, and implying very boldly that there is something illegitimate about this election in America. And yet most people seem to be looking the other way. It's almost such an ugly fact that they don't even want to admit. Well, how do you make sense of this idea of legitimacy in our politics with a president like Donald Trump?
So my series of tweets about that this morning was prompted by the question of how we go on thinking about, say, the continuity and the existence of the United States government under the almost certain outcome that the election results are going to stand and Trump is going to be president. There's a great deal of quarreling right now among commentators on news shows, on social media, about whether people who are insisting on the importance of the charges of Russian interference are refusing to accept the election or are denying the legitimacy of the election. The same is true for arguments about the relevance of the popular vote relative to the Electoral College vote. And I think there's something strange and distracting about insisting too much on a word or a concept like legitimacy. I think that this election illustrates what's strange about that, but that the problem isn't unique to this election. Legitimacy is in its origin a law word. It has the same root as a word like legislation. So something is legitimate or it's not, in the same way that you have a contract or you don't. This is my property on this side of the line, or it's not, it's your property. Legal concepts tend to be binary concepts. And if what you're doing is legal, then from a legal perspective, that's all there is to be said, and you have a blank check to go about doing it and living your life under those rules. To ask about this election, is it legitimate? Well, it invites partly the question that says, yes, it's procedurally legitimate enough that it's going to stand. There's never 100% turnout. There's never a complete absence of interference with the ability of some people to exercise their vote. Under the Electoral College, there's always the fact that the Electoral College, not the popular vote, is what determines the winner of the election. There's no such thing as perfect procedural cleanliness. We run elections anyway, and whoever wins the election according to the rules, in this case, say, according to the Electoral College, they take the office. But it seems to me we shouldn't say that that's all there is to be said. And insisting on an idea like legitimacy is a way of saying, once you're over that threshold, that your installation in power is legal, that's all we want to know. This is very clearly a case in which the very likely next president is going to serve thanks to a procedure that was badly tainted. It was tainted in particular, according to intelligence agencies, by a deliberate effort on the part of a hostile foreign power to interfere with it and to bring this result about. It was also tainted by an increasing move toward making voting difficult in minority communities in a great many states since the, in my view, gravely mistaken Supreme Court decision to strike down state preclearances under the Voting Rights Act. He's going to be president. Does that mean that it's legitimate? Well, the United States government still exists. He legally holds the office. If he signs a budget, that means that it's the budget. If he orders troops into combat, he is the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces. He has the legal authority to do that. But we want to be able to talk about the taint as well. And so I want to encourage people to stop thinking about politics and government using this basically binary legal word, legitimate or illegitimate. He's going to have power. He's going to have relevant authority. And he came by it badly. And we need to be able to think about both of those things at the same time.
How do you make sense of this meme now that we're seeing in the press regarding quote-unquote fake news? Is that a sufficient moniker for the dynamic that we're talking about? And what's the role of a platform like Facebook, which rewards fake news with its really curious algorithms and at the same time flattens out the distinctions between breaking news at the New York Times and a cat video and Alex Jones? Talk about this for a moment and what it means to you as a political scientist.
Well, the first thing that I'll say is that political communications and the use of media and electronic media and social media in political communications, that's an important area of specialization within political science, and it's very far from being mine. I don't speak about it with scholarly expertise as a political scientist, in part because I understand that there's a level of technical knowledge that's needed to be able to really say what needs to be said about them.
Fair enough. Spoken like a true PhD. Fair enough.
So my impression is this. Since the creation of the Facebook trending sidebar, which is relatively recent in Facebook's history, it might have been within the last 2 years, partly as a means of trying to compete with Twitter, which is a place that people can go to keep up on what stories everybody's talking about. Facebook introduced a trending sidebar to make visible to users what stories everyone's talking about. And that sidebar has been a source of continuing trouble, one way or another. There was considerable criticism of Facebook when people started to pay attention to the way that it was being cultivated by Facebook. There was active, direct manipulation of the Facebook trending feed by Facebook employees in ways that tended to prioritize mainstream, leaning liberal media outlets. People documented this. People showed that conservative-leaning stories from conservative-leaning outlets were having a much harder time getting past the filter. And so, in response to this criticism, Facebook moved toward an increasingly automated algorithm with much less human interference. The result of that is that you create a system that can be gamed. The algorithm is responsive to a sheer number of shares. And so if you and a well-defined network of people can deliberately share a piece of news over and over again, then the headline will start trending up in the Facebook right-hand sidebar. Given how little news coverage most people consume most of the time, people are busy, people have their own lives to lead. Those of us who aren't professional journalists or professional political scientists genuinely don't think most of the time that we have good reason to pay very close attention to most of the news. And as an aside, I'll say the professional journalists and professional political scientists tend to overestimate how much we know, too. The world's huge. We can't know a very large fraction of it. So we're very susceptible to what it is that happens to appear in front of our eyeballs in a relatively passive way. Facebook is an incredibly important part of a very large number of people's online lives. And people who aren't reading the newspaper and aren't watching television news still see these headlines creeping up the right-hand sidebar. The fact that the algorithm got automated made it vulnerable to this. And there were deliberate falsehoods circulated. Fake news, I think, is a somewhat misleading way of thinking about this, partly because fake news humor sites or fake news humor programs, things like The Daily Show or The Colbert Report or The Onion, those have been using the label of fake news for a long time. And in the coverage of fake news, there's been some inability, I think, to distinguish. Because The Colbert Report or The Onion was never trying to mislead people. Now, there's an intermediate case, which is Andy Borowitz. Andy Borowitz is a humor columnist for The New Yorker, and he writes things that look like news stories. They're based on the events of the day. They are slightly to very modified in ways that are going to tend to appeal to the prejudices of his very liberal readership, that amount to just saying, you already thought Republicans were stupid, so I'm going to say something a little bit stupider that a Republican said and put it in the headline. They're written in ways that make them really attractive to be shared, and all out of proportion to its actual literary or humor value. Andy Borowitz's columns dominate the New Yorker's online presence because they're shared by the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, very often by readers who don't understand that what they're looking at is fake. Now, Borowitz says he doesn't intend to mislead, and I have no reason to disbelieve him. But I do think the way the New Yorker has used Borowitz's online presence started to lay a path for the transition between The Onion or The Daily Show and this new era of very deliberately false news stories that are then propagated just by virtue of being shared very widely on social media.
Jacob, take a moment to talk about the very idea of citizenship in the 21st century. Again, another element of modernity, and it comes right out of the 18th century and informed and inspired the revolutionary movements that helped to create this modern period. We've certainly seen the demagoguery of Donald Trump use citizenship in a way that we would expect as a club, and that the other becomes the non-citizen. There's an ugly aspect to it, but there's also a very inspiring aspect to it as well that speaks to an individual's commitment to the community and the nation state and principles that they believe in. What crosses your mind at this time regarding citizenship?
I think that those things have always been very entangled. I think the idea of the democratic states community as essentially being a nation state really has built into it a level of exclusion of outsiders, exaggerating the difference between us and them, and suppression of internal dissent. So you start to find a concept like un-American or counter-revolutionary as a way of describing someone who is a treasonous thought criminal for not being on board with the ideological project of the nation state. Your political disagreement marks you as not really a member, not a member in the right way. And that, it seems to me, has always been the dark side of an appeal to a community of people who will politics into existence. If you insist that legitimate politics or democratic politics rests on a kind of universal assent of those who are governed, then when you're faced with the actual fact of political disagreement, or when you're faced with the fact that there are political and moral disagreements that cross international boundaries, you're deeply troubled, and you feel the need to exaggerate the international differences and exaggerate the internal homogeneity. Those, it seems to me, are pre-existing resources left lying around that someone like Trump picks up and puts to overtly bad use, but that he didn't invent. In the European Union and Britain, there had been, for a long time, a genuine complication of the idea of citizenship and the idea of belonging. People who are citizens of countries that are EU members get EU passports, European Union passports. Of what are they citizens? Well, they're citizens of a nation state and full political members of the complicated political entity that is not a nation state, that is the European Union. That, it seemed to me, has, among other attractive features, an ability to diminish the idea that one of these memberships is the most important membership in the whole political world. But people are attracted to the idea of a national homogeneous community that is the one most important thing in the world. And that underlying commitment to a nationalist conception of citizenship, that was one of the forces behind the endorsement of Brexit.
Jacob, I've got a couple of minutes left here, but I did want to give you a chance to address the American listener who is actively looking at moving to Vancouver, or perhaps joining you in Montreal. And what do you say? Because there's a lot of them, Jacob. There are millions of them who are wringing their hands, and they are, rightly, in my opinion, genuinely concerned about the fate of both the ideas and the ideals that characterize what they believe America stands for and what we're all about. And they're looking at property in Toronto, and they just feel like, well, we've lost this great American project. If somebody like that and a cabal like that can take power in the 21st century, then the American project is lost.
So I should note that I'm a dual citizen. I'm an American by birth, and I've lived in Canada for the last 10 years, and I do love living in Canada, and Montreal is a lovely place, and people who wish to look into moving here, I'm happy to encourage it as a life choice. the time isn't yet come for most people, I think, to be taking seriously the idea of fleeing the United States for political reasons. That's not to say it won't come. It's not to say that there's not something rational about starting to check whether you have the eligibility to get visas or passports from the country. But even on a reasonably bad estimate of the things that a Trump presidency is going to do, well, one of the worst things is the prospect of a mass forced expulsion of 11 million currently undocumented immigrants. If you have the capacity to be thinking about moving to Canada and picking up a new passport, you are probably not an undocumented immigrant. You're probably not somebody who is personally in danger from that. You are instead somebody who has standing and political voice. There's the prospect of a mass exclusion of Muslims from immigrating to the United States. But if you are an American who is thinking about picking up an extra passport, you're not a Muslim seeking to immigrate to the United States, even if you are a current Muslim citizen of the United States and rightfully worried about what a Trump presidency means for a climate of Islamophobia in the United States. There needs to be a great deal of political work over the next 4 years to keep the Trump presidency from being as catastrophic as it can possibly be. The essay that I wrote that drew your attention was for a new project on revitalizing liberalism in an age of populist authoritarianism around the world at the Niskanen Center, a think tank in Washington. And I was the first one to sign up to write for this project because I think it's very important to stay politically engaged in the United States right now. There's a limit to what I can do having moved out of the country. But I don't want to encourage people to disengage. I want to encourage people to engage and politically fight with the resources at their disposal. If you're in real personal danger, then that's a different thing. But, well, very many people in the United States are in real personal danger from the normal actions of state activity all the time. There are people who are subjected to police mistreatment and unjust imprisonment and so on all the time. If you're not personally more likely to be vulnerable than very many of your fellow citizens are every day, then the time to start thinking about refuge and asylum hasn't yet come.
Jacob Levy is the Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory, Professor of Political Science, and a member of the Department of Philosophy as well at McGill University. His most recent book is Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom. Jacob, it's been a real privilege, and I have very much enjoyed this conversation and hope we can do it again sometime. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Koi Barefoot.